Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our session on Licensing 101. My name's Susan Bolsover. I'm Senior Licensing Manager at Aardman Animations. If you don't know who Aardman are, we're a multi-award-winning independent studio based in Bristol, probably best known for Wallace and Gromit and Shaun the Sheep, amongst others. So I've been working in licensing and consumer products for over 25 years, so I'm going to be moderating the session today. But let me introduce you to our esteemed panel who will be joining me. Notice I use the word esteemed, ladies. To my left, this is Adrian Scott Mervis, better known to everybody in the licensing industry as Scotty. Scotty is a qualified lawyer and is qualified to practice both in the US and the UK. And I think it's fair, if you don't mind me saying, you've got over 35 years experience. Don't want to age anybody on the panel. Until last year, Scotty was VP of Business and Legal Affairs at Wildbrain CPLG, and she now works freelance, including for some of CPLG's clients as well. So thank you for joining us, Scotty. To the left of Scotty, we have Stephanie Griggs. Stephanie Griggs is an independent creative director and founder of Studio Griggs, where she really focuses on storytelling through design. In her incredible career, I have to say, she's really managed to marry that rare thing of creative and design skills and commercial acumen, which is a real rare combination, to bring endless projects to life, and has previously worked at the Roald Dahl Story Company and for Mr. Men and Little Miss at Sanrio. And Stephanie now has an amazing roster of clients, including, I'm very proud to say, Aardman. So thank you for joining us, Steph. And finally, rounding off our panel is Bethan Garton. Bethan is probably Wrexham's finest export, apart from their football team. I had to get that in because we talked about that this morning. Bethan is currently Senior Retail Manager, EMEA, at Cloudco Entertainment, which is the home of Care Bears. Bethan has worked for a huge array of kids' entertainment brands, including Bing, The Gruffalo, Smurfs, and Barbie. And what Bethan brings to this panel is that real unique retail-first approach, which you're going to learn today is really important. And Bethan is all about connecting brands, licensees, retailers, and consumers. So could I have a round of applause for our panel, please? Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is really around what licensing is. So we're going to explain to those of you who might be new to the world of licensing what we mean. We're going to be looking at some of the commercial and IP considerations from a legal standpoint. We're also going to be looking at those all-important creative assets and style guides, as well as retail and distribution. What we want to make sure is what you take away today. We were very clear when we were asked to do this panel that we wanted to leave you all with some things that were really practical. So what we're going to be covering today is, as I say, what is licensing? What do we mean by that? We're going to be looking at some of the legal considerations, so things you need to consider if you want to start licensing your IP. We're going to be looking at the basics of a licensing contract. I know some of this stuff might be new to people. Don't worry, it's very easy, and Scotty's going to walk you through some of the things you can expect. We're going to be looking at style guides. So what is a style guide? How do you prepare your IP creatively to be licensed? What assets and toolkits do you need, which Steph's going to talk us through. And I say specifically about that style guide, many of you here, if you're used to sort of TV, film and production, might be thinking about sort of an IP or production Bible. A style guide is quite different to that, so we want to make sure that we give you that information. We're going to be looking at sort of strategizing your IP, so really sort of product categories and retailers, and we're also going to be looking at what we do to market that and promoting your IP. We're going to get a panel to leave you with some top tips, and we've also already got some questions, but if we've then got time, we're going to open that up to the floor as well for any questions you might have got. So the two things I just want you to think about throughout this session really is what do you do to set yourself up for licensing success? So what do you need to think about from the very beginning? So this is very much you've decided you want to license your IP, what are the things you need to consider? But also I want you to think about what is the end of that process as well. So what do you need to be doing ongoing? So they're the two things I really want you to think about. This journey we're going to go on is really to look at the beginning all the way to the end. So these are the two things I really want you to sort of think about and really frame that. So before I pass over to Scotty, I just wanted to answer that question. So what do we mean by licensing? This is a very simple graphic. We've tried to distill it down as much as we can. But really what we're talking about is taking your IP and moving that into different areas. So we've called out some of the most common ones we might see here. So consumer products, which we're going to be talking a lot about today. Live events. Also things like location-based experiences. So, you know, at the far end of that, we talk about theme parks, but we don't always necessarily mean that. Promotions and sort of collaborations, and I know that's something Bethan's going to talk about as well. Also things like exhibitions. So actually, if you've got evergreen content, how might you be bringing that to life in terms of, you know, exhibition work as well? And also in digital and social media. But what we've really got at this is IP at the centre. And IP can really be anything. So obviously it can be film, it can be TV, it can be a digital series, it can be a book. It can also be a brand. So if you think about fashion brands like, you know, Louis Vuitton or Gucci, that IP sits in the middle, and how do they work around that? It can be an FMCG brand. So I'm sure we've all probably seen brands like Corona Beer, for instance, or Jack Daniels. They've also got licensing programs, so that's an FMCG brand. Corporate brands can be IP. Harley Davidson's a good one. Coca-Cola is a corporate brand as well. Or indeed, it can be art. So it could be licensing a painting. It could be a museum or a gallery, or it could be an artist. You know, Keith Haring, for example, has got a licensing program. So really, when we think about licensing, it's that IP at the middle and how we then sort of work around that. One thing I would also just say is that licensing used to be linear. So very often we would start with the IP, like a film. I think we're all old enough to remember it used to work like this. And then you would license from that. So you might create a film or a TV series. You'd be promoting that. Then you might do some consumer products, and then you might have a DVD at the end, if people remember those, or even VHS for some of us in the room. I would say that licensing is now circular. So you might have that core content sitting at the middle, but the way people enter a brand is different. They could come in through any of these touch points now. We don't have to think of it as a linear process. But what that's really great is we can then move people back to the IP. And I just want to give you, before we hand over, just a couple of examples. I think one of the ones people might possibly be familiar with is obviously Primark as a retailer. Have a huge array of T-shirts from bands. You can definitely guarantee that half those kids going in there buying Ramones T-shirts or Nirvana T-shirts have no idea who the Ramones or Nirvana are. So they're buying it because they like the design. What is a great way then is to kind of take people back to what that core IP is. So keep that in mind, IP sitting at the centre, but people can come to your IP in many different ways. So I'm going to hand over to Scotty. Scotty's going to take us through. You get to move your clicker on now, which is very exciting. And bearing in mind, we're going to start with where we need to think about at the very beginning. So things you need to think about if you're setting up yourself for licensing. So over to you, Scotty.
So by the time, in order to license IP, you have to know what your IP is, right? Otherwise, what are you granting? So, typically, if it's a film or a television series or whatever, they have done, your production team has done a rights clearance. And in the rights clearance, they look at titles, they look at props, they look at characters, they look at copyrights, they look at trademarks. There's companies that do this, and they clear the rights. And you make sure that whatever you're going to land on isn't already being used by someone else. So, you know, we always laugh at boys' properties, dinosaurs, or trucks. Like, how many are out there already? You know, whether it's Land Before Time or Jurassic Park or Barney. Or, those are my generation. I don't know about the younger generation. I'm sure there's new dinosaurs out there. But you know, you have to make sure that you can differentiate your property so that there's no conflict in the marketplace and there's no, infringement. But so the very first thing you have to do for any IP is your rights clearance, I would say. So they search characters, props. If you're going to have props in your show that you might then do into toys, because people want to sell them, you look at what toys are out there that might look similar, and you try to differentiate. So you have to be aware of what the marketplace is before you even start. That's what I say about IP, because I want to get into what a licensing contract looks like, which is my next slide. But you do need to, that's the bottom line. Because in your contract, you're granting rights, and if you don't own those rights, you're going to get in big trouble. No, you're going to get sued by third parties that do own a conflicting right.
I think, just before you go on, I think one of the things that's important to say, isn't it, is that actually, in terms of licensing, we're going back to that whole thing about it used to be linear, I think very often it was the case that people would get to the point of doing consumer products and then thinking, oh, now I need to think about whether I need to clear this. And obviously what you're saying is we need to think about that right at the beginning, even if you aren't licensing already, or licensing is going to be part of your mix down the line. It's important to do that, like literally from the get-go, right?
Yeah, definitely. So names, titles, characters, logos, logo designs, symbols, visual representations, all these scripts, images, all the clearance that gets before you even start your property, because you don't want to be halfway down the line and then say, oh, there's already a green goblin out there. Damn, we got to change everything now.
Yeah.
And it happens. I see it all the time because, the production team may not be talking to the legal team and, whatever. So introduction to licensing contracts. So the very first thing is intellectual property. So what you're licensing is the property, and you have to have a clear definition of what the property is and what property you're licensing, because you have to define it in your contract. What is a license? The license is what you are between two parties. The licensor is who owns the intellectual property and who's granting the rights. The licensee is the manufacturer, or it could be the manufacturer, it could be a direct to retail, so it's a retailer. It could be, there's different licensees. So they're the ones who are taking the rights, and the licensor basically, in granting the rights, indemnifies that they have the rights. It's unencumbered. No third party is going to come after you for granting these rights. What the rights are and how they're manifest will become clear when Jennifer shows pictures of all the different, licensing programs and style guides, etc. So you're granting the rights to so it's a licensor, a licensee, and the license is what grants the rights. There's lots of terms in there, but practically, commercially, there's usually an advance on signature, and there's a minimum guarantee. So a minimum guarantee is the minimum amount that you expect the licensee to pay for the rights to use and exploit the IP. There's many ways to calculate that, and I'm going to talk about that further, but usually there's an advance on signature, and then there's a guarantee, and the advance is part of that guarantee. And then there's a royalty. So the royalty gets offset against what you've paid in advance. So you offset it, and the royalty could be based on many things. It can be a retail sales price, it can be a net sales price, it can be an FOB price, it can be a wholesale price, and I can explain all those things to you later if it's in the weeds, but typically licensees report on a quarterly basis, and they report on all their sales, and first they offset against what they've paid in advance, and then after that they start getting invoiced for the additional whatever is in excess of what they've already paid. So that's how the model works. It's not very complicated, really. Sometimes there's contingent payments, or there's payments like if you're representing a sports property, for example. If they win, they get an extra 2% royalty, or if they qualify, etc. Sometimes they'll do that. Exclusivity is not very typical unless a licensee is paying a very large minimum guarantee for those rights, because to police the marketplace isn't that easy. And depending on the strategy, again, my colleagues on the panel will talk about how you strategize, how you build your brand, how you roll that brand out, etc. you might want to be very specific and concise in how you roll out your licensing program. Or you might, but exclusivity is very rare. Usually the only time I see exclusivity is in a loyalty program, and that is a promotion. So if you have a promotion where Krispy Kreme is going to use peanuts for a very narrow window, it's called the loyalty promotion or a promotion, then they often, and McDonald's often, they want exclusivity during that promotional period and maybe 6 weeks before, 6 weeks after, et cetera. But exclusivity is rare. Licensees always want it. They want to be the only sock seller in the universe, but trust me, there's going to be sock sellers everywhere. And some licensors will do multi-category, like multiple in the same product category during the same time for the same. And say, you have different accounts, you sell to different retailers. Good. Some want to control it a bit more and maybe won't double license, triple license, whatever. And we'll just, as a matter of controlling their program, again, my panelists will talk about how they do that. But definitely the licensees will ask for everything, but depending on what they're paying and what the scope of the license is, will determine. So you always have a term, you have a territory. There's lots of different jurisdictional rules depending on how large the scope of that is. If it's worldwide, if it's UK only, if it's EU, if it's the US. There's jurisdictional differences about what you can and can't do. How, in the US they allocate retailers under the competition law in the EU and the UK. That is not practice because you have the right, it's anti-competitive behavior basically. So it's a different thing. Some licensors do something called a common marketing fund where they want licensees to contribute to their advertising. That's less, I see that less frequently now, but when I first started there was a lot of that. I was like, well, that's generous. But you might want to consider it. Yeah. There's within the licensing contract, there's all sorts of things: currency exchange, how you determine that, payments, it's usually quarterly, as I said, but in publishing it may be every 6 months. When it's a promotion, it's typically just a fee, a promotional fee, because you're not offsetting royalties, you're not selling anything. Insurance, obviously you want your licensees to have insurance. Some licensors have factory audits. They want to know that your factories work in compliance with good practice, people practice, your corporate practice. So no slave labor, no child labor, no blah-de-blah, because that can be reputational damage to the licensor that you want to avoid. Lead paint isn't a good, or et cetera. You see it sometimes, X shoe companies using child labor, et cetera. So some licensors do control and do factory audits. It tends to be, the big ones who can afford to have a big setup in China. Of course, now with tariffs, we don't know what's going to happen. We'll see. That's another thing. Audits, licensor always has the right to audit to make sure, from beginning to end, how many you manufacture, how many you ship, how many you sell, et cetera. It all add up, that you're not like selling some on the side and putting it in your pocket.
So the licensor really, I think that because there's lots, we appreciate that there's lots to consider. I think the main sort of takeaway really is that the licensor's continued control, and I think that's an important point that we really need people to understand, is that when you're doing licensing, this is not just about selling the rights or leasing the rights to a third party and then walking away. The licensor is involved all the way through that process. Even though obviously your contract is governing the way that you work, that is very much a part of what the licensor does, is to be involved all the way through, to see everything, to approve everything, which we'll definitely come on to, in terms of not only creative assets, but marketing assets, point of sale, marketing plans, retail rollout, which we'll obviously come on to. So I think the important thing really about the contract is it's where all the good stuff needs to sit. It's also the thing that really governs what you do, and it tells you and the licensee or the retailer or anybody else what you are granting, what to do if things are going right, but also it's important to say what to do if things go wrong. So I've always been schooled, largely by Scotty at the beginning of my career, that the contract is really important. So it's really important to get all of the things in there about how you want to control that relationship with your licensee or your promotional partner. I think we're going to hand over to Steph, because once you've now got a contract and you've got all of that good stuff and you've remembered to put everything in, people then want to get going on making nice things. And this is where all the creative come in.
Yes, so you're going to need a style guide once you've got all your legal ducks in a row. So what is a style guide? I mean, it's effectively the designer's equivalent of a writer's Bible. So it's a visual blueprint for your brand. And just following on from Scotty's points around legal protection, style guides actually reinforce consistency and distinctiveness. So they're important for creative ownership, to protect your IP as well. So if we think of it as a curated asset library with a purpose, it's a distillation of your IP into guidelines. So they're usually supplied as a PDF or an online document, a kind of catalogue, and then with corresponding design assets as working files. And they're really foundational to cohesive adaptation. So if we think back to the 360 and all the different touch points, you want to make sure that they're all adapted cohesively across those. So it enables that. There are lots of different types of style guides, and each of them for a brand would carry their own look and feel. So you need to be able to identify which one you need at different points in your licensing program. And if we use the wonderful Wallace and Gromit as an example, so as Susan alluded to earlier, I've been commissioned recently to create all of these guides, and they're all quite different, but quite typical of a style guide library that an IP might have. So you've got core guides that are really the heart of a brand distilled, themed or trend-led guides, which tend to be strand-specific, or they could be seasonal or design-specific, film or series-specific, so content-tied, and then localized. So if you have a global program and you need to adapt it for a specific market, then you, like the East Asian guide that we did recently for Wallace and Gromit. So if we think of style guides as an investment, because they are an investment in your IP, but they should be an extension of your strategies. So brand strategy, licensing strategy, retail strategy, all the strategies, they should be purpose-led so that you get the best ROI, so the best return on investment. You don't want to just create visuals for the sake of it. So each type of guide generally has a different shelf life, and there are a different level of investment that kind of align with that, and they're different sizes as well. So core guides are typically the first thing that will be asked for by licensees. They have the longest shelf life usually because they're not trend-led. They shouldn't be trend-led. And they include generally unchanging elements of a brand, but you want to keep it refreshed every few years. So that has the longest shelf life generally. Packaging guides can vary depending on whether it's a core packaging guide or whether it's more trend-led or retail-specific. Trend guides are usually a lot smaller. They're very kind of agile, purposefully. Sometimes they're called art packs or design packs, and they tend to be seasonal or focusing on a window in a year. It doesn't mean to say that you can't get more time and usage out of it, but they're generally an annual investment. And then for content-specific guides, they are very window specific as well, it's usually a lot shorter window because it tends to be around the release of the content, but you're going to get a lot of high impact during that time. So even though it's a shorter window, it's still a worthwhile investment. So it's worth just saying that they are an ongoing investment. You wouldn't kind of just do this once and then, that's it. You want to kind of keep the investment going, but equally you don't need to have all of these when you first, you're first licensing your IP. You want to start small and strategic and then build it out from there. I think, Bethan, you were saying that there's 150 Care Bears style guides, so you don't need to go straight to 150. Just
We're nearly 45 years old.
Yes, it's built up over time.
We do about 15 trend mini guides a year.
Yeah, so you want to, keep it in line with your own IP. Yeah. So if we look at what's typically included in a style guide, and just zoom in a little bit on the Vengeance Most Foul movie style guide, which came out at the end of last year, it's quite a good sort of example of what's generally included. So you'd usually start with a brand overview. So that might also include characters, cast, just a bit of a sort of scene setting. And then master logos. So a logo system would typically have 3-color logo, 2-color logo, 1-color logo, different shapes and sizes to fit in different areas like book spines or stacked. And what was really important for Vengeance Most Foul was making sure that the logo was actually a typeface rather than a hand-drawn title treatment, so that it could be translated to all the different languages that Netflix needed on platform, of which there was many languages. So kind of considerations like that are also important to think with logos. Color palette, so I would typically do a primary and a secondary color palette. And then with that, you want to make sure that you've got the right values. So CMYK for print, RGB for screen, hex if website is important for your brand, and then Pantones for production as well. And then key graphics. So key graphics are important to most style guides, but in the case of Vengeance Most Foul, this feathers graphic here was really useful as a as whilst the film imagery was embargoed, so it could be used as a pre-release marketing on key art. And then hero poses and phrases for the characters, and just thinking about how those pair together is also a really important part of the guide. And then packaging, point of sale, retail, any guidelines around merchandise as well, which we included in the guide as well. So if we then kind of look how it was used, so the guide in use, the assets were used on key art and marketing across digital, print, and on-platform thumbnails for iPlayer and Netflix. Social media, and the admin team absolutely nailed the social media campaign for Vengeance Most Foul and recently won a Webby for it. So shout out to them for that. But you can see how they adapted the assets so that they were right for the platform, right for the audience, and right for the time of year, with it coming out around Christmas on the BBC. So that's typically how you would kind of adapt the guide as well. You want to make sure that they are adaptable. And then lastly, consumer products. So utilising the guidelines to create a cohesive on-shelf presence at retail across the categories. So one guide and many uses. So just to share a quick note on the file types that you supply as well with your guide, bit of a practical one, because you want to make sure that you're supplying production-friendly assets with your guide. So using Wallace and Gromit as an example again, the native content would be supplied as a still, so a high-res JPEG or a TIFF file. And then you, for photographic and 3D artwork, you want to be cutting that out and providing it as a Photoshop file with no background, so as a Photoshop file, and then also ideally as an Illustrator file, so as a vector, in color and line art ideally, because that's going to be really useful in lots of different production techniques, particularly in apparel and other categories. And it just means that the artwork can be scaled, it can be adapted. They're really useful to have. And then bonus points for supplying all of those in PNG, so just flat imagery with transparent backgrounds. You will be loved by your partners. And they're also really useful for social media, brand decks, layouts, etc. And then just a reminder that everything should be supplied in CMYK ideally, because you're going to be, for licensing, typically it's going to be a production first, print and production first usage.
Can I just ask a question, Esther? Because I think, obviously, for anyone here who's obviously got their own brand, thinking from a sort of TV content perspective, obviously, in terms of the core guides and things like that, a lot of those assets that, you know, the IP owner or the licensor might already have. When it comes to something from the production line itself, so just thinking about, you know, how those assets get from sort of the floor, as it were, and especially when we're looking at, as we've had there, an example of something that is time sensitive. So you've got the content actually coming out at Christmas. Consumer products may be on shelf at the same time. Just a word from you would be really good about the timeline it takes to put that together, because obviously we've got to then deliver it to licensees, which Beth's going to come on to.
Yeah.
So could you just maybe for this audience think, what does that look like? If you want to deliver a guide to get a product on shelf for a film that's coming out at Christmas, how far ahead would you say, typically speaking, you would need to be getting a guide ready?
Using Vengeance Most Foul as an example,
Bear in mind at Ardman we make things very slowly, as everybody knows, so that's a slightly
Well, we
different.
worked on that for a year.
Very
didn't
slowly.
we? That was a year
did.
from January to December with the release, and that was probably way too short in terms of then on shelf. So, but this is the age-old issue with anything that's release dependent and film or seasonal TV series, where you're creating the guide in line with the production, because once the production's got their assets ready to give you, that's still almost too late to be able to get it into the guide and then get it over to licensees to go on shelf. So that's where it's useful to have graphics that aren't dependent on film stills. So if you think back to the feathers graphic that I just mentioned, having things like that, which can be done first, we created that kind of very first as a key asset, that can then go onto merchandise, so that you've almost then got a timeline of products that are going to have the longest lead time of production. What asset can we use on that, to then the shortest, like, you know, on-demand products that can maybe wait until you've got the production assets. So film is almost its own sort of little thing. But if you're using brand assets, or you're creating a style guide where it's, you know, it might be trend specific, or it might be a themed aspect, you want to be kind of working on that, let's say over, you know, 6 months to a year, depending on the size of the guide. But then you want to be making sure that you've got at least, you know, 18 months to, you know, toy is, I'm sure Bethan will come on to that, toy is really long lead times. But with apparel, or, you know, most licensees, if you can then share that style guide 18 months before the on-shelf date, that's an ideal kind of timeline.
Thanks. I think it's just useful for people to know, just to get a sense of what that time looks like, because of course it's got to get from a production into a guide over then to people who are going to make products. So it's just being aware of that timeline and what you might need to do. Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Steph, but I just thought it's a good point we probably should make the audience aware of.
Yeah, well, just to kind of recap on key considerations when you're putting together a brief for a style guide and what to consider. I always start with strategy and then let that shape everything else. So if you define your licensing brand retail goals first, that can then determine the audience, so who you're designing for and what the purpose of the guide is. and that will then dictate the type of guide that you need, the size of the guide, the level of investment that you're going to need to put in for a decent commercial return, and in turn, that will then also help you pick the right creative partner of who's going to deliver that or help you deliver that. You know, do they specialize in a certain type of artwork or a certain type of guide? And then from there, you can brief really clearly and strategically, knowing exactly what you want to get out of the guide so that you're going to get the best return on that investment.
Okay. So we've now got our guide. We're now going to take that to retail. So Beth Ann, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, so looking at categories, in the Care Bear world, we've been around for 45 years, as I mentioned before, so there's not many categories that we're not in, but we have been around for nearly 45 years. Not every brand should go into every category, so whilst we have a plethora here on the screen, you know, some brands, they just don't fit a category, so you might just never license certain categories. So I suggest always thinking about, with your property, what's the heart of your property? So what's the most important product? So I always go back, like, you know, In the Night Garden, the Ninky Nonk train. You know, when you think of that programme, you think of that train. For us on Care Bears, it's in the name, it's the Care Bear. It's obvious, so that is the heart of our brand. And then you kind of go out from there. So always put your kind of, you know, what's the key product in the centre of, let's call it the dartboard or the onion, and then build out from there over years. So it's not all going to happen straight away. And really, you know, think as well about what, you know, who's your target market? So is it infants, toddlers, preschoolers? They're all different. Children, boys, girls. Because that delineates where it's going to sit in store. Is it the kidult market? Which age range of the kidult market? Is it young adults? That's slightly older, depending on people's world. You know, is it, you know, I'm 44, I was the first time round for Care Bears, I'm still a huge fan. Is it me in this instance? So you need to really think about, you know, the age that you're targeting as well, and that will then dictate, of course, which categories that you're going to go into. Be careful that you don't license, as we call it. So don't sign up, you know, 10 pyjama partners. I don't think there would be 10 pyjama partners in any country, but there are numerous pyjama parties, pyjama partners.
Or parties even.
Pyjama party. Care Bear parties.
Yeah. New category, let's get in there.
So yeah, so just think about that and really think about who, you know, you have to really do your homework, either as the brand owner, somebody in your team, if you're working through an agent, maybe they have that retail expertise, you know, who are the preferred suppliers for retailers. So, you know, I've seen it so many times where brands will go away and they'll sign all the licensees, and this is kind of how it was done maybe 20, 30 years ago. You would just go and sign up your licensees and then go and present to retail. Whereas now, you need to be presenting to retail in parallel to talking to your licensees, because you might sign a stationery partner, but then you go and present to retail, because as a brand owner or your agent, you have to go to retailers to present as well. You don't just leave it to your licensee. No one can present your brand as well as you can. And then they'll turn around and say, oh, we're not working with them anymore. They didn't pay their bill, or they didn't deliver on time, or you know, they're financially a bit risky at the moment, or we're just not happy with them, we don't like their design style. You may go to the reseller next door and they're still the preferred partner, so you may end up having to sign 2 partners. So take all of those things into consideration when thinking about your categories. The timeline, so from kind of pitch to shelf, so it varies depending on category. So apparel is a lot quicker, but we are dictated to by the retail buying timelines. So there are retailers now who are already closed for spring summer 26, and we're really only just finishing spring summer 25. So it depends. You know, there's retailers out there who are still buying. HMV, I can still get placement there for this Christmas. Primark, we are done for spring summer 26 virtually. So you really need to think about those timelines. Investment in tooling for the likes of toy. So it's exactly the same process that you'll see here. You know, you have to pitch to your licensees, your manufacturers. You've got to go through the contractual process. It's the same. Some may take longer than others. You know, a really complex master toy partner is going to take longer to negotiate than somebody who's doing socks. Your product development
category really gets it every time.
It
It's
does.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it gets punished.
Okay.
Publishing. takes forever. It does, doesn't it? Publishing takes a long time. And then you need to do your product development. So again, a design on a t-shirt is a lot quicker than a really complex feature, all singing, all dancing toy. Publishing, you want to make sure you get all the narrative, etc. correct. So it just takes a lot longer, so you need to build that all in. But your licensees will know this, so they will guide you. And then they're getting their retail orders, then they'll go into production. So gone are the days, a lot of the time now, where licensees will take that punt and bring in lots and lots of stock. They're really, really careful. And you need to then take into consideration things like shipping. So even though we don't have the tariff problem over here, we have seen an impact where some of our global partners based in the US have impacted us here in the UK because there are containers that were stuck in the Far East with stock that couldn't go into the US because suddenly the prices had tripled or doubled or whatever Trump decided that day. And that then meant containers were stuck. So there were no empty containers to ship to the UK or to Europe or to Asia. And then also sometimes we back onto production lines for big US companies. So the productions had stopped. So all of these things, you'll get all the way to the end and you're like, oh, I didn't think about that. So timelines are really, really key. Because the retailers, once you've shown it to them, they want it next week. Then thinking about the retail opportunity. So again, I've seen it a lot in, over kind of 25 years where people will show you a beautiful brand and then they will ask, oh, I really want to launch it in John Lewis. Amazing. Great from a positioning perspective. Of course, we all want to have our product in the likes of a John Lewis or a Selfridges. But again, the money isn't necessarily made in those types of retailers to sustain and return what you've invested in your kind of animation or content, which is huge. So you have to take note of the value sector, the grocers. Even within that, there's huge differences. So to give you an idea, like an order for a soft toy from Aldi for Europe is like 250,000 pieces. A John Lewis, you might be looking at 1,000. So it just shows you the scale is very, very different, hence the pound signs on the... they're the wrong way round, actually. I've just realised my pound signs are the wrong way round.
Maybe that's about how much it costs in the shop rather than how much you're making.
Oh, dear. And don't ignore Amazon. So, Amazon, it is available nearly everywhere, most countries. There are different versions in different markets, such as Asia. But you can get product to market quickly through Amazon. Their shelves... digital shelves are open every day to place product on, whereas, brick and mortar retailers, you have to work to their timelines. So I recently did a project on food, and that change only happens in September, once a year. So if you miss that September, you've got to wait till the next September. Whereas Amazon, we could get it on the shelf in 6 weeks, on the digital shelf. In terms of the franchise cycle, so what you need to consider is obviously you have your content. That's not the end. That's not enough. You need to think about the brand marketing. So, telling your consumer that it's there. Then social media marketing, the parents, etc. Where are they? Because then we back onto that and we promote products. Trade marketing. So promote on LinkedIn. Tell people what you're doing. Use trade press, licensing press, Toy World, etc. Whatever you can use. You don't have to have huge budgets. But yeah, press releases we think are really, really important. Putting your messages on LinkedIn. Let the buyers out there know that you exist. And then to secure kind of partners, retail, etc. You need to show your licensees. You're not just signing them, the IP. Off you go. We'll see you at the end of the quarter to collect the check with the money. You need to show them that you are investing in your brand on a continuous basis, and that when a mum, a dad, a child goes into store, that they already know about your brand. They know it's going to be in Tesco or HMV or wherever it might be. So retail marketing is really important in store. So everything from costume visits, POS, making sure you stand out on shelf, all of that helps you secure your licensees, and making sure that continues. So it's kind of a circle that just keeps going, either until you have another season going or another film, or if you're an evergreen and you have one thing like, the Gruffalo was a great example. It just kept going and going and going. So, but we just reinvented it in terms of like new style guides, new trends, etc. We had great resale relationships. They knew what we were going to be doing on that brand. The brand owners were constantly out there pitching. These are some examples. So from a Care Bears perspective, we have a big partnership with Miniso globally. So we're in all of their windows, their in-store bays, etc. We have 250 products a year that launch with Miniso, and that is driven by social media. So we drive that through social media. The kidults going in and buying this product aren't necessarily watching our content. I don't know if I should say that in this room. Not necessarily watching our content. It is very much social media driven. So again, just know where your consumers are, are coming from.
I think that goes back to that wheel as well, which we said at the beginning, is they can come into a brand from different places. And I think that's the thing. There'll be, as you said,
so they're
people
seeing bits
buying
of content, but they're seeing it
Yeah.
on social media. They're not seeing it necessarily on a Netflix or a Pop,
Yeah.
which we are on those channels. And then brand marketing. So again, for your licensees, manufacturers, and your retailers, you've got to be making sure that they know that you are investing in the brand. Licensees will invest from a tooling, design, etc. They will not promote your products for you. We do things like we've got Fashion Week. So we were at Berlin Fashion Week, New York Fashion Week, things like the Baby Week in Westfield, Australia. We had the Care Bears exhibition last year on the South Bank. We do festivals. We have, the costume characters out wherever possible, as many times as possible. So brand marketing is really key so that they know about the brand before they go into the retailer. And then when they're in the retailer, that's when then you want to make sure you have a retail POS guide as well as, the guides that were shown earlier, so that you can create things, or the retailers can create things like windows, social partnerships, etc. So, bundle competitions. It can be really simple. And again, it doesn't have to cost the earth. So these are just some examples. Retail. So these are just showing you kind of the breadth of retail. So here's some examples. US retailers. UK retailers, not all of them. EMEA retailers, we now separate them out since we Brexited, sadly. Asia and Latin America. And they all have their different needs, requirements, timelines, seasons. We are the opposite of parts of Australia, where winter, their summer, completely different product. So you need to think about those things. And with that, we then think about retail-specific kind of pitches. So again, these are just some examples. The one on the, which way? This side, right? That for us was very much kind of Primark. Much more mass in terms of that trend, much younger, whereas the one on the left, think of that as something that we pitch to someone like Moschino, etc., much more high-end. We're constantly investing in retail pitches. So whether it be apparel, whether it be home, we have tons and tons of different pitches, and we're constantly producing them on a week-on-week basis and really thinking of that retailer.
Amazing. Gosh, we really
Sorry,
galloped
tried
through
to
all
catch
that.
up some time for you then.
You were amazing is all I can say. Thank you so much. There's a lot there. We completely appreciate that, and a lot to build on. I think what we're going to do, or what I'd like to do in the time that we've got left, and we did mention about sort of top tips, and I think this is very much, I saw people sort of taking pictures and stuff, hopefully. This session's been recorded, so again, it's an opportunity for you to watch back all of the stuff we've talked about. But if we were going to leave these lovely people with a sort of top tip that you think they need to take away from each of your areas, what would it be? And I'm going to start at that end first with you, Bethan. So what would your top tip be, thinking about the area that you've just talked about?
So my top tip would be really think about the time of the person that you're pitching to, presenting. So whether it's the licensee or the retailer, they are being presented hundreds and hundreds of properties. So really think about, why are you there? What are you trying to achieve? Does it fit with them? Don't go and pitch something and ruin your relationship with that licensee or that buyer. They only have so much time. And if you go in and you're not ready, it's too early, the awareness isn't there. Lots of master toy partners, they need an awareness of a certain percentage in order to make it worthwhile investing hundreds of thousands in tooling. So just make sure you've got kind of, a real reason for being in front of that person, and that you're not ruining your chance, because 6 months later or a year later might be the perfect moment, but you've just gone a bit early.
That's a good tip. Timeline is really important.
Yeah.
Steph, top tip.
Yeah, I think my top tip is to not think of licensing as an afterthought. If you're still developing content, you can think about the core aspects of what a good licensing program makes. And so also if someone like myself is then taking on a brief for a style guide, what would I be looking for in your IP? And so just making sure that you're thinking about what makes that distinctive and unique. So things like key characters and their visual signifiers, phrases that they might say, icons and props. Thinking about that at the beginning or as you're developing your content will make your IP more memorable, and it will make the licensing program more memorable and distinctive and ultimately successful as well.
Hopefully make some money. Scotty, what would you say your top tip would be?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I think you need to understand your business model. I think you need to understand, enough to put it concisely in a contract, because the rights and obligations are going to control the relationship. And I think you need to understand it. I mean, so many times I've had discussions with licensors that just don't understand the financial, because at the end of the day, you're trying to make money. We're not making the world better. Maybe we are. But the characters are
I'll take that.
Making people happy.
But I think you need to understand, the business model. That's what I think.
Okay. Okay. So I'm conscious of time, but what I do want to do is just put one final question to the panel. We didn't have time to necessarily take them. So what I'm just want to ask everybody generally, and I'm just sort of flicking through the questions that we had. Yeah, so to all of you with your briefest of answers. So obviously we've walked through in this session sort of that, concept for an IP and getting products on shelf. But I think one of the things also is, what is the timeline for success? Because we've talked a little bit about how long it takes to create a style guide, etc. But in your experience, if somebody has got a brand new IP that they're bringing to market, they've created a great show or they've created a great piece of content and they want to license it, in reality, what does that timeline look like for success? And I know we've all had a bit of a chat about this. So again, I'm just going to pick on Bethan because I think I think we've all got examples of how long, but what would you say?
It really is different in every case. However, think of something like Coco Melon, which I worked on at one point. That was around for 15 years on YouTube before it actually got taken over and then became what it is from a product perspective at retail. And it almost felt like it was an overnight sensation when it came to the licensing program. But, it was very quick, that piece of it, but it had been around already for 15 years. And I know things like Peppa Pig, etc. in the beginning, that took 5 years. So, it really does depend. It takes longer than you think is probably what I would say.
Steph, have you got anything you'd add to that?
I think it's, again, just not to bang on about strategy, but if you think strategically what category or what product is going to be, makes most sense for your IP, and then kind of going from there, realistically, you're looking at a kind of, you want to be looking for a licensing strategy, a 5 to 10 year program or strategy with realistic kind of forecasts across creative and commercial return, in line with retailers. So which retailers would you target for that initial category? And you can start to work out realistically how much you're going to get return commercially. But it's not an overnight like, oh, I'm going to license my brand now and I think I'll pop in, £1 million into my forecast for next year. That's absolutely not how it works. So being realistic and strategic, I think, is the best way to go.
In terms of timelines.
Yeah, forgot that's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Because timelines are also important. I think it's also important within everything we've said about building a brand for the long term. I think we've also seen all of us probably things that suddenly ignite really, really quickly, and people want to capitalise on that. Is there any examples? I can think of a couple, but is there any that you can think of where it's not allowed people to go into a full programme? Or shall I just tell you the one I'm thinking of? Why don't we do that? That's probably easier in terms of you having to guess. So I think it's important to say that something, again, like Netflix Stranger Things, did nothing on consumer products for about the first 3 series. And then I think just ignited And so that was a long lead in. Also, something like Squid Game, picking on another Netflix show, became really popular really quickly. Nothing that they necessarily thought was going to happen. So it wasn't possible to do merchandise at the very beginning. They had to look at things like pop-ups and experiences, because that was the only thing they could get off the ground quick enough. And I think for some of us in this room, we were old enough to remember, if anybody ever tells you, and if they're in this room, Disney, we love you, but that they know that a brand is going to land, that's not necessarily true. I remember lots of licensees suddenly finding High School Musical that Disney didn't even think was going to be a thing back in the day, and people were phoning up going, have you got a star guide for High School Musical? And Disney going, I'm really sorry, I don't know what you mean. So there are things that pop up really quickly. So I think it's important to say that while we've talked about building, if there are opportunities, you might need to think strategically about what you can morph into quickly. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a full programme. So I think that's something is probably worth us just landing on. We've got literally a few minutes, so I just actually wanted to say thank you to our panel. I know anyone's got any questions, you have to find us afterwards. We've definitely got to get out. So I just want to say thank you to our panel. So if we can have a round of applause, please, for Scotty, Stephanie and Bethan. Thank you. Thank you to our co-producer, Daryl, who couldn't be here today, and to our exec producer, Alex, who's in the front here. Thanks to you for your time. If you're interested in finding out more about licensing, I would signpost you to Licensing International. They are our trade body. They have lots and lots of resources. I would also encourage you to look at Licensing Unlocked, which is a program that is run by the global licensing group at Informa. And also, if anyone who really wants to find out more, please come along to Brand Licensing Europe, which is taking place at Excel in London in October 7th to the 9th this year. I just want to leave you. Coming up next in this cinema, we've got Shaping Not Shaking at 2 p.m. So please do come back, and thank you so much to everybody for being here. Did we finish on?